All right, everybody's welcome. We seem to have a impressive number of spectators. Must be because of the exciting agenda we have set up for today. And we are on the cusp of our first forum in memory, so that's good. We may or may not have made it, and we may or may not need it, but still, thanks for everybody for showing. I want to be a little housekeeping first. All right, we're always going to meet on the first and third Tuesdays at 2 o'clock right here. That's pretty well known. The agendas are posted on our committee's website, on the county's website. I don't know about the cities or not. And just ask Northern. And we're trying to email them out as well, but we're not sure it happened this time. So everybody needs to make sure that Northern has the email that you want her to use to communicate with you. I know, Franklin, you're good now. If we had incorrect. But anyway, just help make sure you're aware of when we are and are not meeting and look at the agenda, because I just want to make sure you do the rules and regulations. Thanks.
Okay. Couple of things. We actually have the minutes from July the 6th that we deferred from the last meeting for your consideration. We also have the minutes of what date was that? I didn't write that on the agenda, but June 29th. Those are the ones that got deferred. So if y'all will take a few minutes and look those over, and we entertain a motion to approve those.
I'll move.
Who is that?
John.
Jonah, for both of them? Second by Rankin. Any discussion?
I'm going to ask the question again. Will Dr. Benny's presentation be available to the public?
Yes, it's intent.
I actually already have it on YouTube. It's actually through the Center for Conservation's YouTube channel, but we're going to try to put on a new slide gotten around to it along with some other videos on a transportation.
Okay. I think it would be very helpful to us to make it more easily accessible.
Fair enough. I'll send the link to you, and maybe we just share that out for now. And it's just
Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other discussion regarding minutes? Is there any objection to adopting the minutes by consensus? Hearing none, minutes are adopted. We come to our first opportunity for public comment. We'll have one other opportunity. Any members of the public have any comments to make? We'll go around the room this way. No? We have one stand-in, and I'm sorry, Annette.
Yes.
Is standing in for Stephen Zeller today. Thank you, Mr. Zeller. We missed him, but you know, you're probably much more qualified.
We won't tell him that.
All right, the report from the projects committee is the next on the agenda. Bitsy, are you handling that?
I am. I'm going to ask for help periodically, but I am. So I just wanted to give us a short overview of our strategy and process so far. We broke the Bernie independent school districts. We're using their demographer information, so we pulled all of the planning unit information. Jeff Carroll with the city very graciously put together a much larger map of the city of Bernie with the city limits, the ETJ and the extended ETJ, and where these planning units reside in relative to the city. And we want you to just notice that some of the planning units are actually in a different jurisdiction, Barrett County. So not all of these do we have control over the roads, and we have to develop some partnerships with the folks that do. We are sensitive to and trying to be responsive to the concern that everybody has for the impact of growth and development in our community. But we felt too And we had a real good snapshot by using the BISD demographer report of where that growth is actually heading. So we took the BISD district and broke it into 4 quadrants. We used I-10 as one of our bisectors. We used 46 as one of our bisectors. And then we looked at the districts or quadrants that we created to see which quadrants were going to experience the most immediate growth in the next decade. No surprise, it was the southeast quadrant. So if we can pull up the next file, the southeast summary, anybody? I apologize for my cough. In defense of the IT crowd, I dumped this on them today at noon, so it is my bad.
They love it when we spring things on.
Southeast. All right, so if you will help me center this a little bit, that'd be great. So, doing it the old-fashioned way, I came to the map, looking at all of the planning units and the projected growth in those, in this quadrant. The south of 46, it's east of I-10. And we found 80% or more of all of the growth is projected to hit these particular planning units. So,
80% of the group in that quadrant?
yes, 80% of the growth in that quadrant are in these planning units. So,
Can you explain what you mean by these? Are you pointing to certain numbers on there?
I'm talking about the yellowed out area, and the planning units are the numbers 75, 78, 35, 77, 79, 80, 81, 82, A and B, 83, 84, 85, and 86.
I'm sorry, so when you say these, I was confused. When you said these units, I thought you were pointing to a certain couple of those units, but you were saying the whole area.
It's all the ones in yellow.
Okay.
So I just, being a visual person, I just wanted to see where 80% of the growth that's expected in that area, or 80% of the population, I should say. The total number of housing units that will reside in this quadrant are located in those planning units.
So again, just to clarify, the entire area of the map that we see there, 80% of the expected growth is going to occur in the areas that are yellow.
No,
No.
we're talking about
Southeast quadrant.
the southeast quadrant, which is south of 46 and east of I-10. So there are 2, 3, 72, 73, and 74. At this moment in time for the next decade, according to the survey that they did of these landowners in general, are not part of this massive growth that's coming this way, or the massive homes that are going to be in that. So Wicked 4 is up in here. And these are already, so many of them are already completely full and built out. So what we did as a projects subcommittee is we looked at the road situation within the highlighted areas to see what was in fact on the books, you know, in the capital improvement projects of Bernie that haven't yet been achieved, include the, you know, the roundabout intersection at Cascade Caverns. There are 5 projects in this area. That one, the extension of Cascade Caverns Road from I-10, the phase 2 of that, improvements to Scenic Loop. And all of this is going to be contained in a little bit better format as the final presentation. And then there's an improvement of Cascade Caverns Road from the south entrance of Bernie Middle School to the south road development. So we came back and we looked at some of the other concerns that we had in that area, and we made additional recommendations. of expanding the roadways, like Cascade, Caverns, Old Scenic Loop, Old Fredericksburg Road, from the 2 lanes to a 3 lane, which is essentially using the existing right-of-way.
Does that include Old San Antonio Road as well?
It does. So, by the way, the recommendations are all in the minutes of these meetings, and are on the KCB FOTC website currently. So, you know, and we will be, you'll be hearing this presentation again later on. This is pretty new. There's a low water crossing over there at the county line. It's gonna need some collaborative effort with Fair County. But it's a kind of a choke point when it rains. We felt like a small bridge over that area rather than a roadway into the flooding area would be helpful. You know, so a lot of the recommendations that we have came out of the BISD bus barn for interconnectivity through the neighborhoods. A lot of the kids in this quadrant have the capacity to get to their schools if they had some way to walk to their schools. So we also recommended quite a few walk paths and movement through and around the backs of the neighborhoods and or expanded sidewalks in that area. So we've got, if you'll scroll down just a little bit. Sorry about that, Erica.
Okay, you said scroll down.
Well, it's all in the same scan.
Got it?
Yes, this is it. So this is the total number of housing units that are projected to be in this area within a decade, more or less. You can see where we are currently. Thank you. I appreciate it. This is John Ramirez. He's part of our team. He's the BISD Transportation Director and the surveyor of the bus drivers that gave us a good amount of information about choke points. So we use these numbers, and when I say, 80% of these numbers, it comes from this chart. Rich Senna put this together for us from that BISD demography report. It just allows us to see specifically where things are coming. Not this generic mass of people, but a more specific and targeted look at our community. Let's move on to the next. This is the Southwest. The picture looks a little different in the Southwest. It is going to experience the second highest amount of growth. It's going to be a separate file. So now, if we center that down a little bit further. All right, so now we're looking west of I-10, and we're looking south of 46. As you can see, we've got in the highlighted yellow areas, that's again, more than 80% of the expected population of housing units, which leaves a goodly portion of the remainder of that quadrant not under development pressure. So we took a look at what was planned in the highlighted area, and we focused primarily on that. Fortunately, we have some development agreements in place, part of the capital improvement project that has yet to be done is in this area as well. I believe the Enterprise Parkway that offloads scenic loop road traffic to I-10 to allow it to go to the east is part of that. And then widening scenic loop road to Sophia Circle to improve traffic operations at I-10. And Jeff was able to provide us with some insight on some of the other opportunities in that area. Where is region park?
So like where above is, isn't the region park?
Park is going in, and they have a Bougie Parkway, road that is part of their development work. There's a right-of-way designated in Minger, to connect to that, but they didn't achieve a population sufficient enough to have them develop the road. And there is a small, parcel of property, if it's available, or with conversations with any and all landowners that might possibly help make that connection to Upper Balcones. Is it Upper Balcones? Road, which then enhances the east-west connectivity and the north-south connectivity. We've got the same thing happening down at Balcones Creek, which is the ACCD campus that's going in. What is the name of that road, Jeff?
Balcones Creek Road.
Balcones Creek Road, and I think you sent us some information about that road.
Yeah, speaking of counterparts in the city of San Antonio, there's a developer that's purchased or under contract the Fox Falls property. It's on Upper Balcones, and that development is gonna extend the roadway in the east-west direction from Scenic Loop over to that Balcones Creek Road. So there'll be an east-west connector there from Scenic Loop to either side.
Yes. So we've got another strong east-west connector that will become available to us in the near future. So our intent was to look at the north-south connections and see if we could make them a little bit stronger, because that's where the majority of the growth is going. As far as any of the new roads that go in with these agreements, they will have sidewalks and enable pedestrian traffic. We don't have schools currently in that district, in that quadrant, but I think safe to say that elementary school number 8 is next on the list, and I think that's, I think the land has been purchased or as part of the WCID.
It's in the process.
Yeah, okay, so it's in process, but that's due within the next, I think, 5 years, the elementary school. So we will have a need to relook at sidewalks and the interconnectivity of some of these neighborhoods to see if we can make further recommendations. Far west, in the outlying parts of that quadrant, we just have spotty growth. We don't have, any high pressure areas. We kept, what were the 2 planning units that we kept, that we put in the northwest quadrant? 14 and 12.
Yes.
We excluded those 2, even though they're south of 46, we excluded those 2 because they were more appropriately placed in the northwest quadrant.
They feed into 46 only.
Okay.
So that was.
So they really
no way
didn't
for
have.
them to go south.
Okay. And can you show us the planning units for 12 and 14? It should be just in the next scroll down.
It's 46.
Yes, but I was looking for the table that had the numbers for 12 and 14.
And if you go back.
Going down, excuse my notes. So we're talking about 47 housing units in those 2 districts. So we're not really talking about a very highly populated area. It didn't seem, it didn't seem to justify considering doing anything more than just looking at the current access and egress. So let's go to the northwest quadrant. New file.
It's up there at the top. So,
One of the tab.
I closed it by mistake. It was on a recent file. But file was on the northwest, number 4. Got it, that's it. Perfect.
All right, and then let's center it on the screen. this quadrant, again, you can see that the majority of the 80% or more, is coming along 46. That's where the basic majority of it is. We have some potential development, I believe that is 5. Is that the Wind Ranch that we're looking at? Jeff?
That area right there is next to Ranger Creek, that's Oak Acres instead of.
You know what, I think that's, Birdie Lake.
Yeah.
So that's our favorite development on Birdie Lake, so, that's where quite a bit of the growth is headed in that northwest sector. This is a particularly challenging sector because, so much of it is in the county, or the ETJ. These neighborhoods do have some fairly dense interconnectivity, or not. Marilomas is the exception, I believe. So we in general looked at some recommendations. They were somewhat scattered and not so, thoroughly worked out. We found a couple of problem areas. One of which is Marilomas, which fronts onto 46. It only it's its own access and egress. It doesn't have a back door. There are less than 1,000 housing units in this area. It is not in the ETJ. It's part of the county, and there's just not a whole lot that we can do there. There is somewhat of a little road that connects Johns Road all the way to 46, just to I believe the east of that community. That's used by the bus barn to avoid going back out to I-10 and coming back in on 46 when it does its runs. I have not driven that road, but I've been told it's going to be a little bit tight to try and do anything there. It goes through quite a few properties and different areas, but it is there and being driven. The frontage road in 5 ends at the Friedrich Creek, so it doesn't come across as a frontage road. If in fact, this apparently does not cause much trouble for the school district, and we don't see necessarily a significant enough demand to make an issue out of it, it would require a bridge for the frontage road. This quadrant does not have schools, so we're not concerned about pedestrian and bike paths at this point in time. The neighborhoods do, I believe, have sidewalks. I'm not really sure about that. And then we tackled the northeast quadrant, which actually, if you need to look at that table first, we decided that we wanted to tackle this in 4 different chunks. The first chunk that we tackled was 27 through 47, all of which is in the city limits. We looked at what's going in. A lot of people are going to be in this area. The city has a pretty good transportation plan in this area. The only thing we really felt like we could add to the equation would be to connect some of the development on the east side of 87 Main Street, down south towards the bulk of Main Street businesses, and try and give some of those folks up there an opportunity to walk into town rather than get in their car and take a ride. It would be somewhat down in the future. It's not an imminent need. I think there's 1 or 2 developments up there that might bring in some population. The overlook is there. And Love, is Love, those parties there? Live. Okay. And quite a bit of that is senior which it was a shock to the subcommittee who met that seniors do walk. That's kind of a gig. Being the oldest one in the crowd, including John maybe. So yeah, so then we have to look at the next district, and here's where it becomes problematic. And it became problematic for us. If you break out Esperanza, you know, there's just not a whole lot of growth that's going on in this district. So we took a look at some of the connectors, some of the roads in the top section and the bottom section, because those are the easiest things for us to put our hands around. And then the primary thing that we saw there, and something that has been spoken about for years, is that if you want to go east-west across the county, in the northeast side of the county, you either have to come to 46 or you have to go up to 474. There's no mid-county east-west connector. There is an opportunity there at the end of Kreuzberg Road. It would have to cross the Guadalupe. There doesn't seem to be the demand, but it has been pointed out that that might be a good thing to think about down the road, not only for school traffic, but also for emergency traffic. And I say school traffic because anything that goes on to one side of the Guadalupe, all the school buses have to go on 46 to get back over to the other side of the Guadalupe River. So those trips are doubled, or tripled sometimes, to just move the kids around just because of the difficulty of not being able to go east-west. Esperanza is its own entity. At this point in time, they're going to put over 2,100 houses on the map. That community opens up onto 46. We started to tackle it at our last meeting. As I was looking at the minutes, I'm not completely satisfied. We really spent enough time on it. So we're going to bring it up again tomorrow to talk about one more time. Esperanza is contributing 50%, 57% of the growth of the housing units in that area. The big discussion is, can we give it a back door? Currently, the back door has been discussed. It intrudes on landowners. It intrudes on neighbors in Bentwood. If in fact that we choose an option, and I don't think we will be choosing it, I think we're going to bring this to the bigger committee because there's only one option that can utilize city roads currently. The other options are options that have been, that will move into the ETJ on one of the options of the county on the other option. Those routes further out have been very contentious routes and have been rejected on multiple occasions by the county citizens. So I don't think that the planning committee is actually going to tackle it with a specific recommendation, but we will highlight some of the options that can be discussed, but we're going to bring it back to the remainder of the committee when we get our final report. Having said that, I looked at all of the notes. Esperanza is unique among every other part of the county in the sense of the amount of homes that will be in that area at full build. I don't have the numbers for Wicked 3.
George's Ranch. Yeah, George's Ranch.
George's Ranch.
Further east.
Well, I was thinking of further, just on the southwest side. Is that Wicked 3?
That's 3.
How many total do we have?
I don't know rough on
Yeah. The difference being, Wicked 3 in the southwest area has been working to shore up some of the roads, to give itself more access and egress and not just dump everybody on one road. Esperanza, not so much, but it's contributing, half again is, or double the amount. So we've got a bigger problem to resolve with Esperanza, so we're not quite done. This quadrant, really, we didn't have too many other recommendations. The growth that's expected in that quadrant is not huge at this point in time.
Bitsy, may I ask something while we have this map up? The perimeter, the dark black line, that's the outline of Bernie ISD
Yes.
in Kendall County. Does it show an
I don't
overlay
think
of
it's
the?
in
That's just,
Kendall
that's
County.
just Bernie ISD.
And is there an overlay, I forget, do we have an overlay that shows the Bernie city limits
Yes,
over that map? Because
that would be the first map, John, that we have, that guy.
The tan, this tan color is the current city limits. But there's a whole lot of Bernie ISD that's even off the
But
limits of this map.
do we have, in this map, do we have the Bernie ISD as an overlay? I mean, do we have two maps that overlay each other that
Yeah,
show
it's
the influence of one over the other?
We do, and we can make a cleaner one, but these are all the planning districts, numbers. If you zoom back all the way out.
Those numbers, Gary, are in circles, and they correspond to the charts.
So this is the limits of Bernie ISD, but we cut off the far north end, but we can make a zoomed out version.
And we did overlay the current map
The
with
point,
the planning units to do the work that we did.
the point I was making is that Bernie ISD does not drive the rules that developers have to follow when it comes to street and road improvements. It's driven by city of Bernie, and if those communities outside the city limits or the city's ETJ then fall into the rules.
So
of the
Bernie
county.
ISD is in 3 counties. One of them is
Right.
Kendall, majority of them is Kendall. And of all that, even in this whole upper page of Bernie ISD, only the stuff in the tan is city limits. And the dark green is today's ETJ that we have control over. So there's a whole lot of area that the city of
And
Bernie.
going back over to the northwest quadrant, much of that development is even outside the influence of the city of
Correct.
Bernie,
Correct.
that it falls into the influence of the county.
Correct.
Other than Shoreline, I'd say the majority of it is in the ETJ. Miralomas, for example, is all county.
Or in most recent is what the potential happens in, say, Tapatio.
Tapatio is all out here, so that's way far out of our green line. So,
Okay,
yeah, we have no say whatsoever what happens out there.
okay, thank you.
So that's kind of what gets us to one more conversation and then the assimilation of the final report. A lot of this is probably not new. A lot of this is stuff we've already talked about. A lot of this is low-hanging fruit, and we did that by design. There were a lot of good ideas available to us, not only from the city, the BISD, but, transportation guys had great ideas and recommendations about how to get more kids walking to school. And then we looked at some of the capital improvement projects, and I think actually the Cascade Caverns Roundabout is, part of, under consideration by AMPO, hopefully for funding. But if not, we feel pretty strongly that this should be done, and it should be done ASAP, for sure, because it would help things tremendously in that area. So that's kind of where we went and how we got there and what we're doing. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. We will continue to meet every Wednesday at 10 o'clock at the BISD Administration Building on Johns Road, to finish out July, and perhaps one more Wednesday after that if we can't get to a complete summary report for this larger committee.
So Bitsy, it looks like your committee's doing a lot of work there, and I appreciate the efforts. Will your recommendations come in the form of, here's the population, we're translating that into travel demand for just a summary statement. These are the roadways that we think need to be improved. Maybe you're gonna get to that point?
Yes.
Okay, so will you go beyond beyond saying it needs to be improved? Are you gonna say this needs to be a 4-lane roadway, this needs to be a, you know, left turn lane? How far down the technical road or path are you gonna go?
Okay, so our technical expertise is John, and he has been so helpful. And we are taking his advice, say for example, Cascade Caverns Road, Old Fred Road, you know, in that quadrant. We're gonna put a center lane in, put in sidewalks, get some school crossings, get some lights, and it'll, in certain areas, we can be that specific. On the southwest side, where the development agreements are already in place, where the city is already highly involved, those things are already spec'd out. There's sidewalks and things of that nature, school connectivity, when it's gonna happen, whenever it's gonna happen. We have not been very specific there because we've defaulted to what's currently planned. I don't think we're gonna be able to get to any amount of specificity for a backdoor for Esperanza. I think that is too difficult for a small committee to do. Having said that, then I do think we're gonna be recommending the things that we think ought to happen in these areas and what we think might work would need to then be further studied. And we would have to default to engineering, road folks that are coming on board perhaps, people that have that kind of expertise. The prior committee, I think there were 5 retired TxDOT engineers on that committee. And they could talk about loads and capacity and things of that nature. And we just don't have the depth of technical expertise that the original committee had. But we will give it at our best to be more specific.
Well, Bitsy, I'll put my 2 cents in. I echo Don's comments about thank you, thank everybody involved in this work. This is now getting real, and it's not easy, but it's important, and I really applaud the fact that this committee, we talked about needing a quorum, we're fixing to see one. We're fixing to have things to discuss in this room that will become recommendations. I actually applaud your just recent remarks about you're not trying to design road sections, you're trying to be the voice of the community. And that's what this committee is distinguishing itself from prior efforts, I think, is the level of transparency, the level of community involvement. And I think that's what we're headed towards getting. So what's left, we had a pretty productive phone conversation with AMPO and Jonah about getting our hands on the crowdsourcing data so we can see how these projects really rank in the community in terms of likes, dislikes, ideas. That kind of, we're starting to put a package together and a ribbon around it to say this is what this community needs and wants. And this is good, but this is why we want people in here to tune in, get engaged, and be willing to vote. Because we've got this Esperanza thing. I have a little history with Esperanza in my political career, and it is what it is. And we've
Did I step on your toe?
just opening some old wounds, so I'm sitting here reliving horror stories, but whatever.
Sorry about that.
It's good to move forward. I just really appreciate what this represents.
Other questions or comments?
Well, so, I mean, obviously, you were sort of showing us a list and showing us, listing out what your prescriptions are. Is it going to be possible to see that visually in a map form? I mean,
That's what we're gonna start talking tomorrow about. Jeff and Henry and John and I and Sean. Rich Center won't be able to make it, but we're going to try and pull together some maps that will highlight, what our suggestions are, so that we can visually give you that information. I am recently enough retired that I'm dysfunctional on the computer, and so I don't do well. But Jeff has expertise.
There's the pressure.
Well, and so then the second question in this regard is, we have the GIS, the data from the public survey, and I'm not sure, I mean, are these overlaying together, or did you all consider that? Was that from the previous?
We had nothing to work with. We're giving you what we had to work with. So when we get the GIS data, we can come back together and figure that out. I think that would be fabulous.
And Bitsy, are you all meeting in the exact same room that we were meeting as a committee prior, when we were at the Bernie school?
No.
Okay, you said the Bernie ISD administration building on Johns Road. I was thinking maybe that was the school right there.
Same building, different.
Okay, different room.
Yeah, and if you're gonna come, the reception knows most of us, and we know how to get there, but, she'll come and tell us we've got someone waiting, and we'll come get you. Yeah, or text me and I'll be waiting for you.
Yeah, I asked that because I think the GIS data also has some ideas that I think the entire committee of this previous committee had contributed to. So, you know, it's one of those things about making it a holistic representation of the recommendations of the whole committee. I think it's gonna be very important to figure out how we're gonna synthesize some of those recommendations.
I don't think it's gonna be that difficult, Ben, because a lot of us have some institutional knowledge about a lot of the information on the GIS.
And right now, just to elaborate on what Bob said, I will agree that was a very productive meeting that we had yesterday, and the way we left it is that Cecilio is going to make sure, have some communication with his supervisors and get an understanding for how much time he can dedicate to helping us. And if he has some time to help us, he's gonna help try to repackage some of the stuff. He did make all the data available. It's in our geodatabase format, so we can download it and do stuff with it. You have to have some pretty expensive ArcGIS Pro software on your computer in order to do it, and some training to do that. And I still feel like we have a bit of a void as far as somebody with some good GIS skills who's willing to really dig in and help us with this stuff, has time to do it. I'm gonna try to do some, but I've got some limitations in my time.
Well, I think what he's gonna do is come back with what he calls a proof of concept. He's gonna take one area, I think it was Adler and School Street,
Yeah.
and say, okay, this is how we're gonna take this kind of cluttered up area and refine it into something that is coherent. And if we're all happy with that, I think the next step will be to seek some paid staff. I know you all have a consultant that you pay, and I think that's the only way we're gonna get this done. The city has mentioned that they have some resources, and the county, I think, has some that we can dedicate to that as well, once we know what we're looking for. So.
That'd be fabulous. Part of the difficulty that we have, we're tackling things on a current level, what we have to work with, but we don't really know what the impacts are if you start touching all these spots. If you touch all these spots, like signage on 46, directing traffic to I-10 down 3351. If we have, better access to I-10 off of Herf Road, and then ultimately off of Main Street going through South Burton, back over to I-10. Well, now all of a sudden we've got 3 different ways that we can move traffic over to I-10 from 46. What is the impact on traffic on 46 if you can do just those things? If we can move, school buses off because we've got better access for kids, what does that one thing then add to the equation? So we could use some cumulative knowledge about the impacts of these things. And I think that leaves us with an easier way to look at the whole problem that we're dealing with and understand it with some complexity. And it might make the conversation within the community over controversial things easier to have.
All right, we'll keep on meeting. Somebody has something.
Does anybody else?
Let's go ahead and move on. You want to introduce your guest on the narrow roads, wide nodes?
Sure, so in some of the past conversations, past meetings, questions was asked by the concept of narrow roads and wide nodes, and what the what right-of-way should we have, what right-of-way should we be doing? So we've asked, Kimley Horn is a consultant that does some work for the city of Vernon, and so we have Amy Avery and Jeff Whitaker here today from Kimley Horn to provide us some insight on that concept of narrow roads and wide nodes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Before I get started, I was just listening to your last conversation, and I find it exciting. A lot of the things it's describing, is what I call scenario planning. What if we do this? What if we do that? What happens? So one of the concepts is narrow roads and wide nodes. What if we build the intersection on the road? What happened? How much does that cost? So a lot of times scenario planning, we couple that with the cost too. Like what if we do $2 million worth of 4 projects versus $1 million, $2 million, one. So that's a lot of the decisions that we can test. So when you think about that, the whole conversation was had was all about what we call in the industry scenario planning. What if we do this? What is the impact? That was my way to stall before the presentation.
I think this is our guy.
We're working on it. It's like I could do it right here. I was laughing so hard.
Well, today I kind of took the liberty that what Jeff mentioned to me, narrow roads and large mode, I took it as right away, nodes and segments online, just because I was watching Wizard of Oz when I was doing this. So, my son's first time seeing it, and you have a different perspective when you're watching a movie for the first time with a 7-year-old boy that you don't notice things when you're older. You're like, I can't believe that was in the movie. So a little bit about myself is, I'm Kimley Horn. We work with the city of Vernon. We are transportation planners and traffic engineers. But really we're a group of people. It takes a group of people to come for a project. It's not just about the engineering, it's not just about the planning, it's also the landscape and the built environment and what's happening. So we have multiple disciplines. We're really public focused, but we have private expertise. I predominantly do mainly public work, but I have done a lot of private work on the side, which actually helps as I'm looking at the issues that the private development is coming in and what that growth is going to do. Every city has challenges, and what I like about what I do is I get to work with communities and cities, and every city story is unique. There's always a different, really story that makes the character of why it happened. I'd be interested to hear some of the stories that y'all have. A little bit about me, I've been at Kimley Horn for 16 years, and I lead our Texas Transportation Planning Group. I've done master plans from cities all over Texas, a little bit outside of Texas, a little bit in Oklahoma. I've done cities all the way from Washington, D.C., which this is the fun fact for your barroom trivia, is what city, you know the answers I just told you, what city is the largest mode split in the U.S.? Most people say Portland and Seattle, no, it's Washington, D.C. So, like, that's just something that never comes to people's mind. But if you think about the capital, you would understand that it probably does have the largest mode split in the U.S. And I've done cities as small as Fate, Texas. How many people know where Fate, Texas is? You got one. So, but the earlier you plan, the better. It's a really fast-growing city. Let Amy introduce herself.
Yeah, so I'm Amy Avery. I have been working here with the City of Vernon for a number of years, most recently on the traffic impact analysis ordinance update, and actually just finished a very similar process working with Kendall County on their similar policy recommendations. So familiar with this area, based out of our San Antonio office, and lead the San Antonio transportation team that's based out of that office.
And I've been working with Amy on some of this Vernon stuff for the last 5 to 7 years, and bought my first truck in Vernon, so that's my tie back to Vernon. I grew up in San Antonio. So why transportation planning? And I take a little bit different approach when we look at a typical transportation plan. I think most people think of a map. Well, that map is a very important piece of that, it's a very important piece of that because you're preserving right-of-way. And I don't think anyone's ever said, I wish we didn't get that right-of-way. Most of the time, it's like, I wish we got more right away. So we'll talk about that a little bit. What's often not covered in those maps is the nodes, is the intersections. So we'll talk a little bit about the nodes, and then the segments. I break that up specifically because I think they're 2 important facts. And some of the stuff I can tell by your conversations, I'm preaching to people who know this, so hopefully this kind of goes to other people. I'm going to show you just some examples. I just put some examples of cities I worked in that kind of have maybe the wide nodes, small segments examples, and tell you how they all have different stories. They all have different stories. We can walk through those. And then Andy's going to take over and talk about maybe some Vernon specific stuff. And then this is supposed to be interaction. If you have questions, feel free to ask me. And then we get to Vernon specific and the Kendall County area specific stuff. Feel free to ask us questions as we go through. So why transportation planning? The most important thing to do is reserve the right of way.
you only get it once, and that's why people are looking at the demographics and understand where growth's happening to make sure you're planning that right road. How wide does that road need to be? Unfortunately, if you do a lot of water and wastewater planning, you don't have to really think about the width. It's underground, no one knows what size, you can change the size of pipes. With roadways, it's all above ground, and you really only have 2 or 3 options. You can do 2 lanes, you can do 4 lanes, how big those parkways need to be. So we really need to plan it right and get it right the first time. We want to design safe and efficient nodes. And I use that both because sometimes those do contradict each other. Safe and efficiencies can sometimes conflict with each other. And you want to build segments with function and character. I think a lot of people, they're like, well, we can jam that in there into that street. But if you jam a street, how many of you have driven down a neighborhood street where the walls are on both sides and the sidewalks against the walls, and it feels like you're going down a tunnel? Well, that really loses the character of the city. And transportation is sometimes the only thing that people who are visiting your city know about. So it's the character is really important. And then lastly, I have to put this because I'm a engineer by trade, planner by passion, is you got to understand policy and strategic directions. I think someone mentioned, that's Bernie ISD, but the city controls the policies. So understanding how those policies and what recommendations on the policy side can be as critical in designing the transportation infrastructure as the infrastructure itself. The decision to invest in wayfinding, someone mentioned, is a policy decision, and it becomes an infrastructure decision. So some of those policies and strategic directions are as important. And you never see those on a map. A lot of times when you ask for someone's transportation plan, they'll give you the map, but then they don't have all the policies behind it. So those policies sometimes are very important. So preserve the right-of-way. And this is kind of the generic thing that everyone understands. Creating master thoroughfares helps the city understand where they want to be in the future. I think that's the most important thing, is what is our roadmap, pun intended, to the future, and how do you get there? And so, like, if you don't ever plan it, it won't happen. I remember when this was in 2005, I remember sitting around a table in Flower Mound, Texas, and someone said, hey, let's connect these 2 roads together with an overpass. And everyone's like, that won't happen, that will never happen. But we put it on the map, and sure enough, it's built today. But someone had the foresight to think about it. It took a while, but now it's there. Another example, I'm an Aggie, closer to home. I remember getting laughed out of the room when I said, why don't we bury University Drive through Northgate? So any Aggies in the room? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. Terrible congestion. And that was in 2005. 10 years later, 12 years later, they hired a consultant to explore that. So sometimes you just got to think big and ask the question. But you only get one chance to reserve the right-of-way, because if you reserve the right-of-way, you may not have to ask those questions if you can get it right. So the next slide. I'm getting into the nodes. And really, this was some math we did actually as a part of Fort Worth. And I'll talk a little bit about it. The nodes, how many of y'all complain when you're driving down the street? How many of y'all complain when you're sitting at an intersection? Normally when I poll people, the stress is at the intersection. If you talk to like city staff, their phone rings about complaints about intersections, or potholes, but not necessarily driving down the street. Sometimes there's bad access management, which leads to phone calls down the street, but generally speaking, it's the intersections that are causing issues. But when you look at most plans don't cover the intersection. If you actually look historically, there's not a lot of detail about what to do at intersections. So I kind of think the strategy is, let's plan for the intersections to make sure we plan those appropriately. And most of the time, you actually need a little bit more right-of-way at the intersection to do it the way you want to do it. And so if you're only planning for the roadways, not the intersections, it becomes a really expensive project, because by the time you have to build the intersection, you might have to buy land that's much more valuable than it was when it was originally started. Here's just a quick analysis, and these numbers are rounded. To build a 1 mile of a 4-lane divided road, I use $6 million. That's $1.5 million per lane mile. That's probably a conservatively low estimate today, but it makes for easy math on the presentation. But $1 million per lane mile is the back of the envelope number that a lot of people use for planning. It's probably a little low now, just given the inflation that's happened recently. To build 2 really big intersections, I'm probably high on this one, but $2 million. So $1 million to build 4 lanes, $2 million to build out the intersections. Well, if you think about how much you can push through those built-out intersections, you can get about 2/3 the capacity with the built-out nodes. You don't get 100%. You're never going to get 100% by building out the nodes, but you're increasing 16% of the capacity, or 66% of the total capacity for $2 million for 1/3 of the cost. So if you think about it, if you build the nodes, you can do a lot more around the city. You're spreading your money farther. In some cases, you don't want to do that, but in a lot of cases, it's like if we have an issue, if the issue is, we have a big issue here, we need to build a street, but we need to fix this, you can combine that. But kind of the rule is you get 2/3 of the capacity for 1/3 of the cost. Or you can look at it in the future as you're building, you're spending 2/3 of the cost for 1/3 of the additional capacity. Depends on your perspective of how you want to look at the argument. So this is a very simplistic example. Every project's going to be different. You know, this is just a very simplistic math. So,
Can I ask, what do you consider building out the nodes? What exactly is that?
It's a full intersection with turning movements and turn lanes. And sometimes, and I'll show you an example in Lubbock, they'll actually build out the through lane, receiving lane, and taper back into a 2-lane section.
Okay. Is there a diagram that shows that coming up?
I can show that, yeah, this is a
Okay.
diagram for Lubbock, but it could be mean, there's a few examples when I go through the cities of what they're building out the intersection.
Great. Thank you.
But yeah.
Ready.
And I'll skip to that, if you hold on a minute, I'll have a few slides, I think that answer it. We mentioned about safety and design efficient. So one of the things, if you Google wide nodes and roads, you read a lot about roundabouts, and some of the examples I'm gonna show you are roundabouts, some are not, because I think it's important to look at both of them. A roundabout is a positive solution in a lot of incidents, but so is a signal. So I'm a big fan of there's a solution, like you need to look at each intersection, because every intersection could have a different solution. There are some people that take a very focused approach, but I'm a fan that every solution has an issue. But if safety is a big issue, you can kind of just notice from this picture, if you're familiar, if you've seen this picture before, it shows it's a difficult intersection, how many accident points could occur at that intersection. You know, typical intersection is a lot of head-on, so there's a lot of severe accidents that could occur. When you think about a roundabout, you know, you mainly have rear-end accidents. You've eliminated a lot of those conflict points. So a lot of times the node idea is safety. So we don't want to forget about safety when we're looking at everything. The next slide, I'm going to start getting into a few examples, but level of service is something we also don't want to forget. I put safety first because I feel like that's always a priority, protecting the safety. That's kind of my job as an engineer. But level of service is in conflict with that sometimes. That's moving as many cars through as possible. So sometimes the decision is, in anything in scenario planning, your scenario never usually includes one question. It's always multiple questions. You know, what do you value most? Do you value safety? Do you value moving the cars through? Or do you value aesthetics? Those can come out with different results. But level of services, I put this image in here because I thought this was an interesting image. This is actually a project I worked on. I was a traffic engineer behind this and did some of the element. It's got a whole bunch of different things associated with it. How many of y'all can guess where this is? Just curious.
It could be a Cascade Caverns.
Maybe in the future, maybe. I mean, if you change the interchange to roundabouts, yeah. Jeff could probably get the closest. But this is in US 287 in North Fort Worth. It's Bond Ranch Road 287 if you want to look at it. And I'm going to tell a story. This has always been a problematic intersection. So I was actually started on this project, as I mentioned earlier. I've worked on the private side and the public. I'm working for private consulting and private entities. So I was working for Kroger, which is actually up here, and analyzing. It was terrible. The traffic was terrible. It's probably what you experienced. Gridlock back, almost to the next signal, which
And
is
it
about a
was
half mile away.
their corporate headquarters, right?
No, this is
Oh,
just
a regular.
this is just a
Okay.
super.
Just wanted a
So,
really
so we
big-
were doing the traffic study for Kroger, and it was a two-way stop. There's actually a blind curve you can imagine right here. So the reason it was a two-way stop is no one could see. So TxDOT said, we can't, it was bad. So we did a traffic study. We said, well, all-way stop doesn't work, just gridlocks. It just doesn't work. A signal doesn't work unless you can widen under the bridge. Because if you look at how signal operates, you have to turn. So the operations didn't work. We said a roundabout might be an option. Well, I guess they didn't believe us. They put up an all-way stop, and it was taken down within 24 hours. A year later, we have a temporary traffic signal, thought it would work. That was taken down in about 2 weeks. It lasted a little longer. So finally, they entertained doing the roundabouts. And this is kind of temporary. If you zoom out, this is 2 lanes. This is kind of sort of built out. You can tell the sides of the roundabouts are different. But when you go out there now, there is still congestion during peak periods. Like if you kind of do transportation planning, you have to kind of accept a level of tolerance. You know, maybe during the PM peak we're getting a little bit busier. But this was busy all the time. It was probably one of the worst interchanges in Fort Worth. but now it flows pretty well. No one stops, everyone yields. The biggest issue is some people who just want to stare and look at the roundabouts and drive around because they're not used to them. That happens in some communities, but it was an innovative solution that I like to tell the story because they went through 3 different intersection options in about a 1.5 year time period. And it kind of showed how sometimes efficiency works. And this is built temporary because the road's temporary, it's 2 lanes, and they were just trying to get those turn lanes working. This wasn't really one of the case studies I was going to go through, but it was just it's a great example of, I think very close to what you're saying on Cascade. It's very close to the highway and it operates pretty well. My last thing I want to put is really building segments with functioning character before I get to the case study let's talk about. Is how does right-of-way affect street design? Everything we do, especially in a built environment, is about trade-offs. You have to sacrifice one thing for another thing. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But is there enough room to accommodate all desired features within the existing right-of-way? That's what they question. And I always said, how do you develop pedestrian and bicycle supportive design? Because the way you build a roadway will dictate potentially what happens on that. And I talked about the tunneling filling a little bit earlier. That's the biggest complaint I get in some communities is this is an example actually. I stole this from a master plan I'm doing in another community right now, and the mayor in that community said, I don't want this to happen again. Like, it was entitled, the developer didn't do anything he wasn't supposed to do. That's just what their design standards showed, because I don't want that to happen again. So how do I prevent that? Not because the road looks pretty, but when you can imagine walking along in that neighborhood, it just wasn't a pleasant feeling for them. So, skipping through, I think I go to, this is kind of where I talked a little bit about.
Did I go too far?
No, this is perfect.
Oh, okay.
Retrofitting. So when you talk about road transformations, I like that term. That's what City of San Antonio uses for their term. In my neck of the woods, I'm from Fort Worth, we use right-size road. The term is that there's another term out there used for the same thing often. It sometimes comes with a bad connotation. And words mean more than anything when you're in the industry. If you call something, I was working in a city, in one city, we couldn't decide what to call the road, so we ended up calling 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Because no one could agree upon the name of the roads because they had so much passion about the names. So we ended up calling those names numbers because no one could agree. But there's 2 different things. There's retrofitting, that's what's important. You're in a constrained environment, you're retrofitting, and then the trade-offs. And my personal opinion is it's hard to ever, I got asked by a community to evaluate a road that was being designed in a constrained retrofitting environment. And I asked what their vision for the road was. Because, I could look at it at one lens and say, it's a downtown road that landscaping, sidewalk is the most important thing on the road. Or I could look at another lens and say, parking is the most important thing on the roads, but I know I can't do both. But I didn't have a vision or any kind of guiding documents to make that decision. So I wrote a memo evaluate, and pretty much that's what I said, is like, there's no real way for me to evaluate this because I don't know what the goals of the corridor and the priorities because no one's established them. We need to reach out to the public and understand what the goals are so our design can match those goals. But the idea behind road transformation is reallocating space within the cross-section to be safer and better utilized by the goals on the corridor. That's really to tie the 2 together when we think about this. And so, the next slide. Typical right-sizing roads. I like to show this example because it's when you think about road transformations or right-sizing, a lot of times you get into retrofitting. And in my career, I think I've right-sized road, about 24 corridors in my career, I think I'm right now, 14 within the city of Fort Worth. The traditional 4-lane to 3-lane restriping project typically. But I also think it's important to think about when you're building new development. So I wanted to basically show, here's a right-sizing of a development that was built. And I did the thoroughfare plan for the city, and we originally had the thoroughfare plan just connecting straight across. And we started talking to the developer and the city about the goals of that project. Their goals was to create a neighborhood community that made that connection, but with slow speeds. But if you have a straight shot, the slow speed's not there. So we decided to make a 2-lane divided facility with mountable medians for the fire folks that are interested in that. And has a roundabout, so it bends, has a roundabout. And we measured the speed on here, and our goal was to keep the speed to 20 to 25, and that's about where we established it to be. But if we had done what we originally planned in the thoroughfare plan, which didn't necessarily match the goals were to maintain speed, great connectivity, but we just had a straight line, and when we looked at it, it was like, how do we build this road correctly? So, and this was part of public-private partnership, so this was a combination of the city and the developer. But this road got built, and it's kind of a cool section. It's got, these are actually, I believe these are 8-foot trails, or might have been 10, but, and these are 10-foot lanes, so a little bit narrower than your typical lanes. But the idea was to slow down people. The goals of this project was to slow down folks in an aesthetic environment. So this was a brand new project, but a lot of times we think about right-sizing roads, we think of like existing projects, but you can do the same thing on current projects. There was one in College Station that I was working on for the Aggie friends in here, and their standard cross-section said 40 feet wide. And the reason it was 40 feet wide for a 2-lane road is it had buffer bike lanes, and we just basically said, we don't want that for the neighborhood. It's a neighborhood. We want to build the 24-foot lane with 2 trails on both sides. We're really building the same thing, but we're taking that concrete pavement and putting it in the trails. And it's built today, and it looks well, and I think it matches the neighborhood and establishes the goals of the project. It's very similar to this. It's like, hey, this is what we want to do, but it's just different things. So I'll skip 2 examples. I'm gonna start with Fort Worth. That's where I'm from. That's kind of my heart and home. So their thoroughfare plan has some interesting things in it. They live with, basically they require an intersection control evaluation, which basically means what I said earlier, is that you have to think about each intersection. You just don't put a template on. It's like, what's the best environment? Is a roundabout here the best? Is a signal here the best? Is an all-way stop? When you get into interchanges, there's more options. They have to look at the bicycle network and make sure they're accommodating something for the bicycle network. And they also have aesthetic corridors. Sometimes that's forget, because that is your community character. And during TP, they have roundabout considerations. At one point in time, I think the pendulum always swings. They did one thing one way, sometimes it swings the other way. They kind of went with the mentality of, let's build a roundabout first and prove to it shouldn't be a roundabout. They've gone back towards, well, let's figure out what's the appropriate thing. So when you look at Fort Worth, they have a lot of roundabouts built in the last 5 or 6 years because they had that more policy. But they have guidance on roadway and priorities and benefits. So let's skip to the next slide. This is the one I was talking about. This is the, to an extent, the Lubbock example, which I was mentioning in your question, is how many of y'all been to Lubbock? I think you can land at the 737 on their roads in some places. They're really big. And they realize that you can get anywhere in Lubbock, it's great, you can get anywhere there in 15 minutes. I mean, you can go from our office on 98th Street, I know I can get to City Hall, and I can be at 15 minutes before the little notice on your meeting can come up, and I know I can make it. So it's a nice environment. But do they really need to spend that infrastructure? I mean, every road was 7 lanes, and every road was planned to be 7 lanes. And it costs money to build those roads, and then it costs more money to maintain those roads. So we went through and actually developed this concept of wide nodes, and that's actually what we called it. We called it big nodes, smaller links is what we called it. So it wasn't the exact same thing.
They're not small, they're not narrow still.
Big nodes and smaller links, because they weren't narrow nodes. But they were 7 lanes that were going down to full 5. And this was a big change for the city. They've been doing it this way for 100 years or however long. This was done 3 years ago. And now they've now built 2 or 3 other roads. So what they did is they kept the same right-of-way on all their roads and said, hey, we're just not gonna build it. What's not shown here is they're building 10-foot trails next to it. All the roads that they downgraded now has become the trail network. But they're building out the intersections to allow for the dual left movements. And on some of the streets, they do neck these down. As someone mentioned, is they always would build, they have the opportunity to be able to push lanes through, even if it necks down to 2 lanes. A lot of people, when they, and this is kind of a nerdy traffic engineering thing, is if you can get the 2 lanes through and then neck it down after, it's better than dropping the lane before the intersection. So sometimes when you're doing a design, you'll see some people drop the lane before. It's kind of better to get them through and merge together, assuming you have the money to do that. It's just better practice. But that's what Lubbock has been doing, and we're working on a few projects right now that's really, so this was their design standard. This is their new design standard. A little oversimplified. And there's 2 projects under construction using the new design standards. One's an MPO funded project, so they were, from a funding standpoint, is their own design. Old design standards didn't really have any multi-level accommodation. So for those who go through MPO scoring, et cetera, that's really important to the MPOs now. So when we changed it, it scored a little bit higher, because now they're having 10-foot trails and it's connecting places, et cetera. And then one that hit home to me was, it's Colleyville. How many of you are familiar with Colleyville, Texas? It's kind of in the middle of DFW. So it's like smack in the middle, just in smack in the middle, and they made a decision during the transportation planning that they wanted to keep the rural nature of the community, and they wanted to keep 2 lanes. That was kind of their goal, like, we don't want 4-lane roadways going through our city. Very complicated to do when you're really smack in the middle of the metroplex. So they have to maximize their value of the 2-lane roadways. They have a lot of traffic on these roads. So they have to maximize. So they use, on a side note, they're a city of about 30,000 people or so. So they don't have to maintain their own signals of TxDOT. So the only signals they have in the city are on TxDOT facilities. So that was a consideration as well. They didn't want to have to maintain their signals. So they built a lot of roundabouts. And so this one right here is Glade Road. Glade Road carries, I think, about 14,000, 15,000 vehicles. So it's a pretty busy street for a 2-lane roadway. But they were able to carry it through where none of their intersections really stopping. It's busy. It's a constant stream of traffic during the peak periods. But it always is moving. It doesn't really stop because there isn't always stop farther down that they're retrofitting to a roundabout now. But up into that always stop, it moves. And this has a lot of those slip lanes I was talking about. So it's 2 lanes. It's got a lot of slip lanes to allow people to move. And the slip lanes work around. There's actually a school up there, so they have some innovative pedestrian crossings. But they're carrying probably the most volume that they could on that road because of the way they treat their intersections. This is another one that when we were planning it, we really didn't think about it at the beginning. As we started diving into it, we realized this was a perfect solution for roundabouts from a small loads. Is this movement right here is an extremely large movement. It makes sense to do that connection because it would do the same thing, right? Well, they wouldn't, this is not gonna sell. It's never gonna sell, or they're gonna, this is not going to be going through anytime soon, and we know that. And I'm sure you deal with those type of issues on planning for roadways. So we made a plan to do 3 series of roundabouts because this one was built first, this one was built second. This was the most complicated one because of all the left turns right there, and it's installed today. And one of my coworkers said, back when this was a stop sign, it would queue back up. I think 20, 30 vehicles, we did the study. Now he said it queues 2 or 3 vehicles, it flows. It's busy, but it constantly flows. This was kind of the dream scenario with this really, there's no traffic down here, so it's kind of like, you could argue that this is the main road, and the roundabouts allow that to happen. So kind of redirecting traffic in a way, that's kind of how we did it with the roundabouts. The next example,
Can I ask you a
Sure.
question? On the prior slide, you said that the roundabout on, no,
Oh,
not
sorry.
that one, but this one. You talked about that intersection with the unique pedestrian crossing.
Yeah.
We have some intersections that could probably benefit from a unique pedestrian crossing related to schools.
Yeah, so this one right here, roundabouts, so when you come to a signal, you push a button, it stops the traffic. So roundabouts sometimes, the negative sometimes on a roundabout is pedestrians. Like, if you don't see a pedestrian, do they know how to stop, et cetera. So at this location, we did some flashing beacons where you can push the button and kind of light up the intersection when someone's there. Actually, the original intent was that the traffic flagger could be out there and help pedestrians, et cetera. So there was a big concern. It ended up not being as big a concern as when it happens there because most of the people driving this road, there's enough signage out there, they realize during school times, the school speed limit sign that they slow down. But there was a big concern with being built about pedestrians. They spent a lot of money on making those crosswalks and those pedestrian accommodations visible because there's really 2 things you can do with pedestrian accommodations: make it really visible or really stop the traffic. So it's kind of one or the other. All improve safety. And on this road, if you look at some of the best practices, making it as most visible as possible was the best solution for this road. And that's what we did.
Well, and I just think to Jeff's point about picking the right control for the intersection, one of the other beautiful things about the way these all loop together is those movements now can all occur with very little overlap because all of those left turns become right turns, and they're using different halves of the roundabouts. And so this particular configuration was also really, really great for that, and that's why it's important to look at what are those primary movements, and a lot of times people will try to make a roundabout fit, and generally, it is a great solution, but sometimes, if depending on, if you've got everybody only using 1/4 of your roundabout, you're really not gonna make anything any better. And so that's why really taking that individualized look at the intersections and picking the best type of node is the best approach.
And I think patience is sometimes I tell people too, is this one actually came in first for some reason. I think this one was second, this one's third. And so by the time we got to the third one, people were like, my issue hasn't been fixed, because the issue, in reality, thinking about it, we probably should have started with that one and worked the other way. It's just, the PM peak was this way, the AM peak was that way, so which direction do you start in? And it was built over time, because these things, roundabouts are not the cheapest thing, especially in these situations. Remember I said right away you can't get, none of these have the right of way, we got to get right away. And also the important thing about roundabouts, if you don't plan for it, is the water and sewer lines and the drainage. So if you're not planning, and if you go back to the transportation plan, if you're not planning to put a roundabout there and you go to retrofit a roundabout, it's not necessarily the cost of the pavement necessarily. It's sometimes you have to redo the drainage, redo the water lines, redo the wastewater lines. So planning for those in advance, but even if you don't build a roundabout, putting the utility lines in the right location would help. And all these we had to relocate. Or we only designed that one, these were by other firms, but all of them had to have relocated water and wastewater lines.
Jeff, is that also true when you look at overhead utilities?
Yes. That's a whole different discussion, but on roundabouts, we have to relocate them. On streets, that's a whole ballgame of what do you do with overhead utilities. Next slide. So this is the city of South Lake, and I think they did a really good job of really saying, the city of South Lake's relatively built out, if you're familiar. There's not, unlike y'all, you have a lot of room to grow and a lot of land developments that are happening in Kendall County, et cetera. They're relatively built out, but they were trying to figure out how do we maximize our nodes. So they did a citywide intersection study, and every intersection in the city that they targeted, I think there was 30 of them, has like a little report that says, here's what we're planning, here's what we're gonna do. And it just really helped them kind of figure out what's a priority, what's not. And I just put this one in here because I think it just emphasized, and you may have someone at the city of Bernie that is familiar with the city of South Lake, but it's still bring home to them as well. It's just a snippet from the project. The next slide is, I think we kind of go into, there's a lot of information in that. Amy's going to kind of take over a little bit of Bernie, but we'd love to hear your questions and your thoughts or anything you want to throw at us, but she has a kind of a set slide for it.
Oh, mine's real short.
Yeah, real short.
You guys can jump in on questions. So I think Jeff mentioned that this is a really long game. Planning is not instant gratification. It takes a while to evolve. You can set aside the right of way, and it may be 15 years before that development comes in that actually builds it. So the city can chip away, but a lot of it is going to come from development. So as I mentioned, working with the city of Bernie and Kendall County over the last several years, really looking towards how can we shape that new development so that they're coming in and they're doing the things that are going to be consistent with the long-term vision for the community. So that's the part of it. And then there's going back and looking at the existing corridors and how are you going to fix some of those issues that are legacy issues, they remain. I wish we had magic wands, but it takes a long time to move a lot of these conflicts we've discussed to fix it. But you can start to chip away at it even as something's redeveloping. You can get a little bit of right-of-way here, a little bit of right-of-way there. It's definitely a very slow game to get it all glued together into something where you can go back through with a project. But you can start to chip away at those pieces and looking at the enhanced nodes. And then I know, I'm gonna bring this one up, I've heard this crowd like this project. We worked with TechStud to look at this at one point, so hopefully you guys won't run me out of the room. But an example very close to home for you all. But I think it's a really good example of how, depending on the context of the section, you can make this fit what you need. And so I know we use the big D word, and nobody likes to be on a diet. And so there's just a lot of baggage with that word, right? You just think you're losing something. You see deprivation. And so that's why I like transformation, because it's a trade-off. I think that word captures what we're really doing, which is saying in this area, which users are the most important, and how are we gonna accommodate that? And when you look at this road, this is the exact same curb-to-curb width, but in different areas, we can do different things. We can put a center two-way left turn lane where there's a lot of driveways. That gets your left turners out of the way, removes a lot of those rear-end collisions that have been happening. At signalized intersections, turn lane. We we need a dedicated turn lane so we can run that protected cycle at that signal. If that signal stays, you could mix in a roundabout in the middle. That might be a little tighter, we probably need some right of way for those, but there is an opportunity. I've done some fairly compact ones, especially once you already have everybody down to one lane each direction. You've got flexibility for mixing them up. And then, in an area maybe near the old number 9 where you don't want all those conflict points, you don't have all those driveways, let's put the median in and provide a really great place for pedestrians to have a refuge. I know there's some work coming for that crossing now, but there are other locations that may not have quite the volumes that you have there with a trail and dedicated destinations. But you may be near a school, you may be near another generator that's not gonna have quite the constant flow, but could still benefit from having that refuge. You're only crossing half the width at any given time, and you just get a lot of flexibility out of the same exact cross-section from paying attention to what's adjacent and thinking through what you wanna do. So there's the retrofits, and then there's shaping what's still coming. And I think both are equally important as you work through your planning processes, and you're identifying your pinch points, you're identifying where those missing connections are. But Esperance is a great example. It's gonna take a while. There's a line on the thoroughfare plan out the back, but it's gonna take a while for those family ranches to turn over and the opportunity for those pieces to fall in place. In the interim, some work can be done on the nodes, but it is a very long game to get all these pieces to fall in place. And with that, we definitely want your questions. I just wanted to provide some food for thought.
So, I love this whole thing about, I love to use it, you say it flows. Like, I love hearing it flows, getting through some of these notes where we get these pinch points. One of the things we were playing with on our GIS map was this connection, this sort of ring road of roundabouts that would take you kind of off of 46 at her, run you up to Blanco Road or Adler, and then cut you across back to Main Street and north. And then you could head off toward where Curve Award, I think they're going. And I'm wondering if if you guys have looked at that kind of, or would look at that kind of traffic modeling as you look at your thoroughfare plan for viability. It's a roundabout of
Yeah,
it's a loop road of
yeah.
roundabouts.
A loop
Yeah.
of roundabouts.
Yep, we're doing something very similar, like, the Colleyville example is somewhat like that, but it's not, those are collector streets, maybe our minor arterials, but not like a bypass or ring road. In another community, we have a ranch that doesn't want to sell, so we're doing an interim improvement of bringing the road straight down, doing around, but doing exactly what you said, but the ultimate vision is to connect it through the ranch. So we have a phase 1 coupled with phase 2, part of the planning process is to identify the universe of opportunities, and there's no wrong answer. It's just as you go through it, some answers may make more sense than others. And so,
But I think from a question, and I interpret that a little bit different as which document is going to capture those needs, and I think there's a blend. I think that the goal of the thoroughfare plan is to definitely look at all of the long-term connections, the missing links, the pieces that just aren't there. And some of these can be captured in what you're talking about, but that's more of an operational analysis that's really gonna dig into what are those solutions for the existing intersections. So it's twofold, right? Because if that corridor, or combination of corridors that creates a corridor, that particular one, a lot of that right away is established. And so anything you go back in there is gonna be more in that retrofit category. And that's where I think the transportation plan going beyond the map and having the priorities and the guiding principles and the other criteria helps you then when you go dig into those other corridors, you look at more specific intersections, you could say, okay, here's 5 solutions, here's what we said were our priorities for this portion of town. Help us, that helps guide towards which control is most appropriate. But typically at the thoroughfare planning level, you're one level up and you're looking for those larger, long-term, 20, 30-year, long-term plan, I guess, given the name. And then the other one would really get into the nitty-gritty of a lot of that more retrofit.
yeah, a lot of times, most of the time it's about funding. So if you're doing a transportation plan, you stay at the 10,000-foot level, which is trying to answer certain policy directions. And then our recommendation may be the let's do a detailed preliminary engineering report for this corridor, and here's some guiding principles for that. I have worked on a few mobility plans where they'll say, we're gonna lay out the top 3 projects and get into that level part of the planning process. But sometimes it's good to have a good break point, because sometimes those, instead of just that transportation plan in 6, 9 months, or whatever it takes, when you add in, it's good to have a stopping point. Hey, we've established that, let's go to the next point. So that's, most cities do what Amy said, but there are some, when you Google transportation plans, that get those higher level detail. Good question.
So, thank you all, I thought it was a fantastic presentation. I'm holding my applause until I finish questions and answers, I guess. So one of the things that I thought, as we started this process with the Transportation Committee that really sunk in for me was that a 2-lane road can carry a huge amount of traffic. It's just the weird little turns and the people, the driveways, people pulling in and the intersections that seem like they really back it up. And so I think that as a basic principle was really enlightening for me, realizing, just interstates where you're going 80 miles an hour on a or not interstates, but roads.
State roads, yeah.
FM roads.
Right, when you go 75 on a 2-lane road, there's carrying a lot of traffic. And, I worked on the Blanco Road project as well, and I felt like in that case, we did a lot of analysis, we looked at all the data, everything seemed to support that was a perfect scenario for a road transformation. I think maybe that's a better term, more descriptive term. Yet we had a really hard time selling this idea to people who in their minds, they saw reduced lanes as a big loss of capacity. And so I don't know if you've had, I'm sure you've run across that before, but did you have any experience or ideas as far as how to communicate about this stuff? Obviously calling it a transformation maybe helps, but in a way where the community can understand it. Because, in our experience, we just found that people, a lot of people had, I think, a very knee-jerk reaction that this would cause traffic to back up and the road to be much more congested.
I've got a few ideas, but they're all ideas because, every person's different and everyone has different objectives and goals. I think that's the key, is understanding what their goals and their fears and objectives are. So in some communities, we've said, this is a temporary restriping. That's all it would be, is you can start the project as a restriping project. And we're gonna evaluate it within 12 months. And if we don't get the desired outcomes we like, we're more than willing to put it back. So you kind of set the stage. The other thing, the first road diet I ever did in 2007, the people were opposed about it. I realized because I was calling it a bike lane facility, they were not fans of bikes. But as soon as we were adding parking on that street, when I started calling it this project's for parking, they automatically did not care about the bike facilities. Because I met with what their goals on the project were, was to increase parking. So I don't know what that is on Blanco specifically, but if there's a way you can say how this benefits them beyond, like maybe they're not bicycles, maybe they're not, that maybe it's an opportunity to, in Blanco, I could see us as you walk down Blanco, like that sidewalk's right on the road, there's not else to do. So the bike lane's as much as protecting the pedestrians as the bike lane itself. But I think the short answer is is really understanding their needs. I've done a bunch of in Fort Worth, and typically there's always people that are in every road diet or every road transformation I've done. There's always people that are hesitant or maybe against it, however you want to look at it. And it's really just listening to them and trying to find something for them that helps them, whether it's one of the hardest road diets I did was West 7th and Fort Worth. It's a very busy corridor, it's a very popular corridor. It's a 6-lane facility going to a 4-lane facility, and it carries like 30,000 vehicles, so it's very busy. But everyone was nervous, and I was like, do you want people flying through your facility, or do you want them going slower? Do you want them to accommodate pedestrians better, bicycles better, the transit facilities better, bus stops better? And the answer at the end of the day, everyone, if you put them if you ask them their goals, we're not trying to trick people, and you ask them their goals, a lot of times they put the goals up there, and their goals sometimes contradict what so it's like an education process. Like, you want a safer street, you want a slower street, a 2-lane facility will slow down the traffic. And if those are your goals, let's try it.
Well, and I think on this particular corridor, knowing some of the baggage that the corridor carries around, I'm a little reluctant to bring it up. I thought this group could handle it, and it would be a good discussion point. roads got looked at, but I don't think all of the concerns got addressed. So I know that along the way, TxDOT was asked to evaluate a traffic signal at Plant Street. TxDOT came back and said it's not warranted. Honestly, it's never gonna be warranted. There's not enough side street traffic. That could be a great opportunity for a roundabout, because there are safety concerns, there are concerns with people finding gaps. Could also be just easier to do if you're only looking at traffic coming from two directions, and we can provide the left turn lanes on both approaches. So there's lots of some opportunity in this, but it was done very piecemeal. It was like, well, what about Plant Street? No signal. What about this? Well, that's not gonna work. And there was no look to say comprehensively, but at this intersection, look what we're gonna accomplish by having a dedicated left turn lane. Look what we're gonna accomplish here at the post office by having a place for people to be out of the way turning left. Those pieces, I don't think it wasn't looked at holistically and comprehensively. It was very piecemeal. And I think that as education is such a big part of it and understanding people's concerns, that I think because of the friction that's in the corridor from all of the turning movements, the immediate reaction was, we can't take away any space. But the trade-off by getting those lefts out, from a safety standpoint, from a progression standpoint, is just amazing. You don't have people trying to jerk around people and get back in. You take a lot of the aggression and friction out of it just by providing that.
I think the biggest key, Odu, if you look at it, and I don't know the details behind Blanco, the most, I'm saying this kind of transformally, is usually if the police officer gives the police chief,
That's good
gives the,
strategy too,
gives the
yeah.
meeting, like the reason I want this to move forward is because of safety, and I think this is a proven safety. Usually carries a lot more weight than the traffic engineer or the engineer saying that. So that from a strategy standpoint, we've done that a few times, so, because he's like, I've responded to so many collisions here, I think this will help, et cetera.
Yeah, I think.
The opposite could be true if he said the opposite, but you know, just.
Well, we also didn't have a consulting firm look at it with us, right? It was a bunch of members of the community talking about, well, how do we make this really complicated little spot work, and trying to figure our way through it, and so, or at least I wasn't involved in a consulting firm.
Well, and there was a time crunch, right? So it kind of like concerns came up and people were like, well, let's swap that one down. Let's swap that one down. But ultimately there was a deadline and we have to decide by this date because TxDOT needs to take these steps. And I think that it just didn't allow that comprehensive look at it.
One of the things we need to take away from this is a couple of things. First of all, a node is an intersection. So a road, a two-lane road, has tremendous traffic capacity until you get to the intersection. That's the problem. So they're talking about different ways to address intersections. Keep that in mind because we're going to get into that as we move along. The other thing is, you've heard me preach on this over and over and over about when you determine a future right-of-way, you've got to protect it. We've got all kinds of plans, thoroughfare plans, that show thoroughfare someday. Well, but did they ever approve the thoroughfare? No, they didn't. They drew a line on here. But has it ever been actually approved? And the city has approved it. Once they approve it, then you can protect it. But until you protect it, somebody's gonna develop a subdivision and they're gonna forget about that thoroughfare through there. And what are you gonna do now? So the thing we need to take out of this here today is, and they've said it over several times, about protecting the right of way. You may not use it for another 10 or 15 years, but it's there and you can use it as a planning guide for what you're gonna do in the future. The next thing you need to look at, just like I've been looking here at Blanco Road, and I wasn't on that committee, so I'm just gonna tell you what I think. Well, first of all, let's back up a second. Let's take Esser Road down between Blanco and 46. That's a fairly wide road. Okay, you could put bicycle lanes on each side and still have 2 lanes. Actually, you could have 3 lanes, I think, down the middle. Me personally, I don't like to drive 45 miles an hour with a narrow bicycle lane. I just tell you, that's my opinion. To me, it's dangerous. But could take Blanco Road, and again, I'm not saying which I like the best, but I'm just saying, you can take the top one where you have 4 lanes out there now. You could make it 2 lanes, one in each direction with a turn lane and bicycle lanes. That would have the same capacity as the 4 lanes have. Because you can take a 2-lane road, and like, we're gonna be talking about like Old San Antonio Road and some of these others. If it were made a 3-lane road, it would have tremendous capacity because that middle lane gets rid of all the people that are turning left and blocking a 2-lane road. So, again, we need to look at what we want to propose. You need to acquire the right-of-way for some future long range, and all this study we're doing on long-range planning for the different subdivisions and how many people are gonna be around and projected traffic volumes. Well, maybe a 3-lane road would work great now, but someday you may need a 5-lane road or whatever. But plan for it now, because once the right-of-way is there and the people build their businesses right up to the property line, if you ever have to go back and buy a right-of-way, you may buy just their parking lot. You know? The business is still there, but the damage you've done to the business is taking away their parking, so they don't have a business. So now you've bought the entire business, you paid for it, you don't necessarily get it. So going back to what we're talking about, you've got to preserve the right-of-way that you think you need in the future. You know, all this stuff pays off in the long term. So anyhow, like I say, the thing we're taking out of this is protecting and preserving future right-of-way, looking at the capacity, and a lot of the capacity problems are intersections. And the intersection can go from different types of simple intersections to roundabouts to full-blown interchanges. You know, you get a big 4-lane, 4-level interchange like at 410 and 10 in San Antonio. Well, the reason you have that is because you got 500,000 people a day traveling, and you can't go through a stop sign on that kind of thing. So you do this. So these are the things we got to keep in mind as we're approaching what we're doing or trying to do here. So just remember, protect the right-of-way, look at cost-effective ways to take care of the nodes and intersections, and you'll be way, way ahead. And we need to think about all this as we move forward.
Mr. Adelman, you had a question or comment?
You know, and I'll just, this is the public, I was thinking, if you wanted to sell Blanco, just tell them it's quicker in and out of Mary's Tacos.
Well, yeah, and I know that was a big part of the concern. And Jeff has a great example where sometimes those concerns that come up when you ask people, what is your biggest concern? If something like that floats up, then there may be an opportunity to work with the singular issue. I think Jeff had an example of a school that was really problematic, and they worked with, oh no, it was Chick-fil-A. And they worked with them to retool what was happening inside their site, kind of provided the technical resources to make some improvements, and then obviously it was up to the private property owner to do it, but having that plan in place for them as well, you know, because most of the time these businesses don't really love creating that big of a problem and having a reputation where they pop up at every meeting.
You had great tacos.
Yeah, but when you, but that's listening to people and hearing what those concerns are, and can we solve that concern? Because it has nothing to do with this whole 4-mile stretch of road, we have one problem spot. It's the same idea as the nodes, it's just a different kind of node that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, one sentence I always go back, this is the planner meeting, like, the vision of the road is safety, that is a safety concern, so how do we solve it? I was working on a Main Street, and their vision was to have no driveways on the road. Like, we have a great grid network, where are we putting driveways? Well, in order to accomplish that, we have to work with every property owner, and when we met with the property owners, we have to rebuild some of their parking lots because the way the driveways are circulated. So when you have that vision, sometimes you gotta bite off a little more than you want to chew.
So one more comment I'll make is, as we're thinking about all these different roads, we're talking about new roads. We need to consider very limited access or no access to them. We're not developing them for developers. We're developing these roadways that we'll be talking about to move traffic, not for creative development opportunities. done some of those and they work quite well.
Jeff and Amy, thank you very much for your presentation. I do have one question, sort of administratively. Is there any problem, copyright infringement or anything, or credits we need to give if we post this on this Transportation Committee's website?
I don't think so. I think
Yeah, I don't think so, and I actually realized I did have some, if anybody wants some paper. I glanced over here and I was like, shoot, I was supposed to offer these at the beginning.
Would you mind passing some?
I got distracted by
Tim,
trying to
you
get
had
the
a comment?
PowerPoint.
Well, I just, I'm old fashioned, I like the paper.
Okay, well, the paper's coming.
Okay,
Here, I'll
thank
start
you.
some at different spots.
While that's getting passed out, we're quickly approaching our conclusion today. And we have one piece of other housekeeping business. As I mentioned, we have had some problems with achieving a quorum. We overcame that today, but we said that we would consider some alternative wording so that if we fail to have a quorum and we needed to get a
Somebody back there
decision,
make it.
we could get there. And so behind the agenda, if you have the agenda, is some recommended wording. The top stuff in italics is what we agreed to, and the longer portion in italics is what I'm recommending. And this is strictly for discussion, unless you want to adopt it today. And so this is what I understood is the sense of this committee. Appointing entities whose representatives have not attended most of the meetings since the committee restarted will be contacted by the co-chairs and apprised of the situation. If they determine they no longer desire to be represented on the committee, their representative will be removed from the role of voting members of the committee. In this circumstance, the vote required to move to modified consensus, and the vote on the question both require an affirmative vote of at least 75% of voting members to pass. If an entity desires to continue participating in the committee's work, it will be given the opportunity to replace the non-attending representative or take other actions to appoint a replacement representative. Likewise, should the representative of an appointing entity fail to attend 3 consecutive meetings, the co-chair shall contact the appointing entity and ask that it replace the representative who failed to meet the attendance requirements.
You're awfully soft on that, Don. I think there's a point when the representatives don't show up, and I like the 3 meetings, that their seat is vacant, and that allows us to move forward on the quorum question. The way it's presented here is that then it falls back on you or Bob's labs to go through the hoops to contact the group to see if they want to appoint somebody else, and now we dragged it out another 4 to 6 weeks, and we still haven't solved the quorum issue. So I'm not sure.
I'm not looking for extra work.
No.
I am concerned about somebody that doesn't report back to their entity that
No, I
they
think you solved that
represent.
in the early paragraph. But at some point, regardless of who they represent, if they're just not showing up, that seat needs to be vacated. And it should, at that point, change our count so that we can keep moving forward on the quorum question. Because the second paragraph is just saying, we have a lingering issue here, and we're gonna keep allowing it to linger without a solution. Does that make sense?
And I think I've got a fix to that. I like the concept, but I think this is fairly complicated. Let me suggest this, if I may. I mean, it's easy for me to sit here and make changes to what you guys propose, but I'll do it anyway. Here's what I've got, and it addresses your question too, Gary. I've got appointing entities whose representatives have not attended most of the meetings since the committee restarted will be contacted by the co-chairs and asked to make new appointments. Until such new appointments are made, such entity representatives shall not be considered for purposes of determining consensus or modified consensus among committee members when making decisions. That's the first paragraph. Second paragraph is simply this. Likewise, should the representative of an appointing entity fail to attend 3 consecutive committee meetings, the co-chair shall contact the appointing entity and ask that it replace such representative, comma, in accordance with the terms of the immediately preceding paragraph. I think that captures our intent. Plus, I don't want to give entities the ability to opt out. I mean, we want them to stay involved in the process. I don't want them to say, oh, okay, we don't want to appoint those people, we'll just kind of remove ourselves. I don't want to give them that choice. I want people to stay engaged, and unless they make new appointments, they can have people come, but they're not going to count towards our consensus or modified consensus numbers.
Have you considered a career in the legal profession?
No, yeah, my mom wanted to be a lawyer, but I just became an attorney instead. Thoughts? I'm not wedded to this. I have no monopoly on the truth.
Well, but
It's-
to your point though, I mean, for example, I know Kim Blom, she's currently out on maternity leave, plus she just wasn't, around a lot. Well, I mean, we kind of resumed that she was sort of heading into her maternity leave mode, but nonetheless, the Chamber of Commerce is a rather important entity to keep in the
Yeah.
loop here. Yeah,
But the fact that she's on some sort of leave, I think from what I'm reading or hearing, your suggestion is that her seat is open till the chamber solves it. But it solves our quorum issue. And what I'm hearing is a quorum issue, not what personalities or who's
Right.
represented or not represented. If we keep coming under 50%, we're just not able to take action on certain things.
Was that a motion, Tim?
Yeah, I'll move that language I just stated be, okay, there we go. And I'm happy to provide this to our more than capable scrivener.
I would like to add a point of discussion on your motion.
Okay.
Which is just that, what I like about what you have here, Don, is that if there is someone who appointed a representative to be on this committee, and they are unaware that they have not been here for 3 or 4 terms or whatever, I think we should have that conversation with the person who appointed them and give them the opportunity to communicate but before we just strike them and say, you know what, you're off the committee, you need to appoint someone else. They should have the opportunity to say, oh, let me call them and see what's going on, and call them and they should let them know. I mean, maybe there should be a very quick action there, but we should at least give I feel like we should at least make the effort to reach out to the person who appointed these people before we made any decisive action on their role.
Jonah, can we do that after 2 missed meetings in a row? Just sort of modify it to say, after 2, if I miss 2 meetings in a row, you call Mayor Handren and you say, Bob, Vanwolf ain't coming. He's got 1 strike left. You better talk to him. And if I don't show up a 3rd time, and Mayor's talking to me, I'm gone. So I like that. I like that concept of giving them a heads up after 2 missed meetings in a row. And if they miss the next one, then this kicks in.
As co-chair, I wouldn't mind that after 2 meetings making that call.
Yeah, I think so.
On behalf of you guys' wishes.
I think that makes sense.
We've got to have quorums to go from where we are to where we need to be.
Well, I think that's what we talked about a long time ago, basically the same thing. But to Gary's point, I can see that if we had several people not attending for the 3 meetings, and after the 3rd meeting they're out, and they're not replaced pretty much immediately, then our quorum number should drop. Otherwise, you never would have a quorum. Y'all want to see what we're talking about?
And this language accomplishes that, John, because it says their position doesn't count towards establishing the quorum requirement. They're just
Until
not
that
considered.
person is replaced or
Right,
returned.
right.
Yeah. And what I'm saying, if they don't replace them immediately, or say they decide not to replace them, well, then the quorum number ought to go down.
Yes.
It will.
That's what
It
he's
will.
proposing.
Yes.
Okay, that's, okay. That's,
Does that solve the chamber issue that the person is on an extended leave?
I think it does.
It does.
Because it does not
It
kick
does.
them off
Right.
the committee, it just says the quorum number is gonna go down.
But she's
And,
on leave.
and you're on leave, but just be aware that if you're on leave, that's gonna happen.
Then should we put something in there to say, in terms of the absences, unless approved by the chair of the committee? For example, if you are on leave, the provision that you just stated really doesn't give that option, at least how I heard it. So if somebody goes on leave or they're on a business trip, then they can call and say, look, I've got a reason why I can't be there, but can you approve it, as opposed to automatically at the combine the two, but in this way, it gives the chairman some discretion, you all some discretion on saying, yeah, that's a legitimate reason. As opposed to finding a replacement.
To me, the concern there is that you could have a lot of legitimate reasons, but we also have work to get done. And so, I think we found a pretty good solution where we're not kicking anybody off for not showing up, but if you're not here for those number of times, you contact the person, maybe you contact Mayor Handrick, or Joey Evans hasn't shown up here for a few times, and Mayor Handrick says, oh yeah, I know, he's gone on some business trips, I've talked to him about it, we're good, and quorum number goes down until I get back, or something. And that way y'all can continue your business. I think that might solve it.
So I think you have a motion and a second.
What's the sense, yeah?
And we have a quorum.
We have a quorum.
Well, we'll do consensus first. Is there any objection to adopting the language proposed by Mr. Banner?
I like it with the kind of modifications that we've discussed.
Right, the call after two missed meetings in a row. I agree.
Hearing no further objection, I'd say that the motion is adopted by consensus. We'll give that to our scrivener if he
will.
make part of the minutes. Very good, thank you all very much. We have one more opportunity for public comment. Oh, excuse me. We did discuss the AMPO meeting. I don't know that we need to revisit that any further, other than that there will be some action on that. We'll report back to you at the next meeting or subsequent meeting. That's something tangible that we can look at.
I'd also like to offer, the Cow Creek Marijuana Conservation District is currently drafting a resolution about the idea of crossing the Citywide. I'm not saying, it's not saying against it, it's encouraging that we look at all other options before defaulting to a crossing, and if a crossing is made, to of course take extreme measures to ensure the hydrology and the water quality is accounted for and protected. I have a draft of it, I didn't have it printed out for today, but I'll bring it to our next meeting. It will be adopted in about a month.
Public comment? Tom?
Tom Edelstein, my main comment wasn't about Mary's tacos. I thought this was a great presentation today. It was great for a lay person to learn all this. I know that John and Don, you guys know all this stuff. But I was wondering, you had asked Bitsy, Don, beforehand about how much detail would these suggestions have. And you've also mentioned in the past, excuse me, about getting money from the city to get experts, and these folks sure seem like experts to me to look at our proposals, and, you know, there's a bunch in there, and give us their expert opinion about, oh, well, there's a little something you could do there, or maybe you could combine that with that, and kind of have it maybe polished up a little bit. And the committee's done great work, but we have these experts here that, and maybe we have money, and I learned a lot today, so.
Can I go back on topic comments? I learned a lot today also from you guys. Thank you very much for the insight, because I'm not a planning and transportation person per se, but I think I'd like our little projects committee to take just another look at, especially in these quadrants that we just gently touched on, because there didn't seem to be a whole lot that we could do, since the development itself has taken care of the majority of the issues. But I think we can maybe take another look at some of the intersections as they feed. I'm thinking in particular the northwest quadrant that fronts on to 46, and maybe we can relook at some of that data and see if we can discuss intersections as well, whereas we have not previously done that.
My sense, to respond to you, Tom, is we're not quite at a point where we need consultants, but I think we're going to at some point in time. I think once we get to that list and there's consensus that this is a pretty good list, then let's start talking about, well, what does that particular project really look like, and what does it consist of, and how does it, what benefits do we expect to achieve out of it, and refine that a little bit more. I think right now we have a whole bunch of BBs out there from a shotgun. We need to kind of narrow it down some.
Can I throw one other comment out? I know, sorry. But one of the things I think that's been a common theme in our transportation planning committee has been to look toward innovative solutions and try not to replicate the same old sort of traffic-inducing strategies that have been the hallmark of Texas transportation planning in the past. And so I'm speaking over to you guys because I know you're going to be working with thoroughfare plan, but again, I don't know how much that
They're
falls.
bastions of the hallmark of transportation.
Well, they're not, I mean, that's not what I saw today. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, the defining word has been mobility in this room. Mobility, 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 and, you know, we talked about traffic inducement, and trying to see what we can do to avoid that. I think Mr. Kite was referring to that we're not just trying to create the context for blowout growth, but actually intelligent growth that's built around smart mobility solutions. So everything we can do to either influence the way developers are developing or plan thoroughfaring so that it provides multiple modes of mobility will be helpful, I think, to this community going forward, and what we want to embrace in our retrofit recommendations as well. Does that sound fair? Does it sound like it?
No, I don't think you have any disagreement.
And can we opt for roadway enhancements rather than road transformations?
You're
We're not
whatever
gonna
you want.
discuss that today. Not today.
You must be billing by the word.
Oh, yeah. I'm making
Is
a
there
lot of
any
money.
other comments from members of the public? If not, we will adjourn the meeting. We'll see y'all in 2 weeks.
Thank you all.
Hey, Gary.